Good afternoon, good morning, listener. This is Voice of Faith Radio Church, and I am here. My name is Kingsley, and this morning we are going to be talking on something very important, which I think affects every human being, black, white, small, big, short, tall, and whatever category of human being. This theme or this topic affects everyone. I'm not going to be doing that alone. I have here with me my friend, my brother. He's going to introduce himself.
Good afternoon, listener. My name is Samuel Idako. It's good to be here.
All right. We are going to be talking about relationships. What are relationships and how do they affect us as God's creatures, as human beings living on this terrestrial globe called Earth? Over the years, we have had one form of relationship or another. Human beings are creatures of relationships. Whether you like it or not, they say a tree does not make a forest. So it is not possible to live on the earth and not be involved in one relationship or another. We have brotherly or sisterly relationship, family relationships, workplace relationships, marriage relationships, friendship. All these are different forms of relationship. Today we want to be looking at relationship in general, especially as they affect maybe the employer and the employee, the mentor and the protege, friends, even family. So we are going to be talking about this, and I want to ask Samuel maybe one or two questions and also contribute to the topic. Samuel, what's your take on this, generally speaking? What do you think relationships are in the first place?
Well, thank you so much, brother. Well, when you know, like you rightly said, human beings are social beings, essentially, right? And it's just how God made us, right? God made us to be like this, so you can't live life, just independent of other people. You must have relationships, whether it's in the family or in the workplace, or life. In short is a series of relationships, right? It's a network of relationships, whether at the family level, in the workplace, between friends. You can't do without the other. Right? Essentially, no man is an island, like we always say. So this whole idea of I'm a loner doesn't even exist. Like some people will say, "Oh, I'm a loner." You need people in life. You need people in life. Whatever it is you want to do, you need people in life. Nobody can set up a company alone. And so, even a sole proprietor needs needs people to work with him. At some point as the business grows, right? Two people start a family and then they start growing, right? If God designed, or if God had it in mind that people should be loners, God wouldn't create you and put you in a family. Right? So, at the end of it all, the long and short of it is that we are social beings. It's how God wired us to be, right? So relationship is essentially human beings just interacting with one another. That's what it is. And then you have that at different levels, like we have stated.
You were talking about. You always talk about the relationship between David, Jonathan, and Saul. Can you throw more light to that as it affects us as human beings? Because the Bible says those things were written for an example to us, on whom the end of the world is come, or the end of the age is come. So when we talk of, I want us to talk about goodwill, and then you tie it with the story of Jonathan and David, and what the Bible says about that kind of relationship.
So we know that Jonathan and David were very good friends.
Yeah.
David essentially came to the house of Saul. We know that story. Saul had some mental issues, would I call it?
Yeah.
And I would call it. And David had to be brought in, to help deal with that situation. And then somewhere along the line, he became friends with Jonathan. And we know how that story ended, right? Yes. Good old King Saul became jealous of David, because David did something that was outstanding. And then the people at that time saw David as, some sort of folk hero, and Saul became envious of this very young man who had done something that nobody in Israel could do. Here was a giant who was tormenting the living daylights out of everybody. And, David stood up to this giant, killed him and beheaded him, right? Killed him, essentially. Killed him, and Saul couldn't manage that. Saul became envious of David, and we know how the story ended, right? Saul kept chasing David until at some point, that conflict came to a head, where David stole into his camp, picked up his jar, and said, "Look, I won't harm this man, in spite of all that he has done to me." But David said something that, every time I look at it, it scares the living daylight out of me. Here was David and Abishai in the camp of Saul, while the king was asleep with all of his, with all of his, what would I call it now? Bodyguards, and yes, his army. And, Abishai was like, "David, why don't you, God has given this man into your hands. Why don't you take a spear and, just finish this man off?" And David said, how would I do this thing to God's anointed? And he said, I wouldn't do that. Who knows, maybe this man may die in battle or something. And David didn't know.
So that was a prophecy.
He didn't know he had passed judgment on Saul. Wow. He didn't know he had passed judgment on Saul, which brings us to the issue of good we are talking about. I believe, this is my belief, that there are certain relationships you don't tamper with.
Wow. Please, can you say that again?
There are certain relationships you don't tamper with.
Wow.
Right? Because there are relationships and then there are relationships. There are people who God will place in your life at some critical point in your life who are like pillars. That's my belief.
Wow.
Right? And that was the kind of person that David was to Saul. That was the kind of person that David was to Saul. And Saul tampered with that relationship, and we saw how it ended. I could go on and give you examples. Jesus and Judas.
Wow.
Right? Jesus and Judas. We all know how Judas ended up. Because he tampered with a very critical relationship. We saw how he ended up. We saw how he ended up. Right? The story of Abraham and Pharaoh. Right?
Yeah.
we saw how that played out. In his own case, he didn't even know that this he was lied to. He didn't even know that this was somebody's wife. But by mercy, God showed him mercy, and and God still said, "Look, tell Abraham to pray concerning your issue." Right now, imagine after all of that, he has he still went ahead to forcefully take that woman and disrupt that relationship between himself and Abraham. Only God knows what would have happened. Right? Wow. So relationships are key. There are people, and this is where we need to discern. We need to have this. We need to be wise enough or sensitive enough to know those kinds of people who come into our lives at critical points in time. We need to be careful the way we treat people.
Wow.
Right? Because relationships hinge on how we treat one another. Attitude.
True.
Right? So some people say, well, I'm in a privileged place today, so I can do to people whatever I like. Right? I don't care. Today I'm the king. I can do as I please. Right? And nothing is going to happen.
Wow.
Right? Now, if it doesn't happen to you, it will happen to your children. We've seen so many examples. And like you were saying before we came here, relationship is a door opener.
It's a door opener. Yeah.
You know, we live in a part of the world where people are so heavy on curses. Oh, I'm cursed, so that's why things are not working for me. Oh, my mother in the village, you know, is doing something, and that's why my destiny is not moving forward. Many times that's not the case. You know, you're not just a good person. You know, you need to check the way you relate.
The way you
people.
relate with people.
Yeah, you need to check the way you relate with people. You know, I mean, if you are broke and you can't ask your neighbor who is just next door, then it says a lot about your character.
Wow.
You know, oh, people are going to go to town with my story and say all kinds of things. You know, like we're saying before we came here, just that's veiled pride.
Wow.
You know, and people are going to say a lot of things, so you rather die. That it says a lot
pride.
about
it's subtle pride.
Subtle pride.
Wow.
Subtle pride.
And a lot of times people don't know this is pride.
They don't know this
They don't know. You see, I was, that's so true, because you see, there's something called the theory of projection. This was propounded by the great, phenomenal psychologist, what do you call him now? Sigmund Freud.
Okay.
Yes, he talked about the theory of projection, where we project other people, we project ourselves in other people. You see, now in Titus chapter